What if the earliest story of the American South wasn't told in diaries or painted on maps, but encoded in the bones of the people long before explorers arrived? What if before Charleston and Jamestown, before cotton, slavery, and the Civil War, there was already a story woven into the very cells of those who walked these lands? This story isn't written in books. It isn't etched into stone. It is buried deeper, inside blood, bone, and genome. A genetic empire, long silenced by war, disease, and forced removal, is only now beginning to speak again through science. Modern genome sequencing through mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosomes, and high-resolution SNP analysis has pulled back the veil of time, and what it reveals about the Southeast United States isn't just surprising, it's revolutionary. Because every Indigenous American, from the Arctic Circle of Canada to the Andes of Patagonia, descends from a single ancestral group that crossed a vanished land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska. This bridge, called Beringia, existed during a last ice age, roughly 26,000 to 18,000 years ago. And when the ice walls closed in, that small group became isolated, genetically distinct, the founders of all native peoples in the Americas. Around 16,000 years ago, they began a breathtaking migration southward. In only a few generations, their descendants reached the very tip of South America. Along the way, these pioneers branched, split, and diversified into countless lineages. And within that branching, the Southeast, the forests, rivers, and fertile valleys of what is now Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, the Carolinas, and northern Florida became a unique stronghold. This was more than land. It was home to a genetic cluster unlike any other on the continent. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole weren't just culturally unique. Their DNA carried something scientists are only now beginning to understand: an astonishing diversity, a richness of lineages preserved across thousands of years. But how did it survive? How did their genetic story resist the homogenizing tides of migration and mixing? The answer isn't just in DNA. It's in culture, tradition, and the structure of society itself. Because while tribes in the Northeast often followed patrilineal and patrilocal systems, where women married out, moving into their husband's community, the Southeastern tribes built the opposite. They were matrilineal and matrilocal. Women remained in their homelands. Descent was traced through mothers, not fathers. And so, mitochondrial DNA, inherited only from women, stayed rooted in the soil of the South. Generation after generation, mother to daughter, these lineages grew diverse, not diluted. Genetic memory was preserved by culture, and the result? The Southeastern tribes possess some of the highest mtDNA diversity anywhere in North America. This was no accident. It was intentional. 1,000-year-long cultural continuity encoded into the very rules of marriage and kinship, shaping the genetic future of entire peoples. And yet, much of that genetic legacy is missing today, because something happened. If the DNA of the South was once so rich, so deep, and so enduring, where is it now? How could thousands of years of continuity collapse in the span of just a few centuries? The answer begins not with swords or guns, but something smaller, something invisible, something carried across the ocean in the breath of strangers. It began quietly. A cough, a fever, a shiver on the skin. The Southeastern tribes, with their rich and ancient lineages,
had endured ice ages, migrations, and centuries of cultural endurance. But nothing in their evolutionary history prepared them for what arrived on their shores in the early 1500s. The first Spanish explorers stepped onto Florida's beaches and the Gulf Coast carrying more than ambitions of conquest. They carried pathogens, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, microbes their bodies had long learned to live with, but which indigenous immune systems had never encountered. One sailor's sneeze, one hand on a wooden gate, one child's cough echoing in a crowded village. That was all it took. The chain reaction was unstoppable. What had survived millennia was undone in decades. By 1600, some southeastern tribes had already lost half their population. By 1700, others were reduced to a fraction of their former size. By 1800, as many as 95% of the indigenous peoples of the American South were gone, erased not by war, but by disease. This wasn't just death, it was erasure at the genetic level, a phenomenon scientists call a genetic bottleneck. When only a small portion of a population survives, the diversity of lineages collapses. Entire branches of the human family tree vanish forever, leaving only fragments carried forward by chance. And chance was brutal. Among the Muskogee-speaking peoples, the Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw, entire clans carried unique mitochondrial haplogroups. Some disappeared overnight. Others endured only because a single woman survived a wave of plague and passed her lineage onward. Today, when researchers survey these populations, the differences are startling. Tribes sharing language, ceremonies, and kinship show radically different DNA profiles, not because they chose to diverge, but because disease chose for them. But the devastation didn't end there. Even as disease ripped through their villages, another wave of destruction began, the forced removal of the survivors. Between 1830 and 1850, under policies like the Indian Removal Act, nearly 100,000 indigenous peoples were violently uprooted from their ancestral homelands in the Southeast. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, they were forced westward along paths that became known as the Trail of Tears. The marches were brutal, cold, starved. Thousands died along the way. Those who survived carried with them not the full richness of their genetic heritage, but only what remained after centuries of disease and displacement. And in the lab, the scars are visible. The mitochondrial haplogroups that once defined the Southeast are now splintered, diluted, or extinct. Entire genetic lineages erased, not by time, but by trauma. But while one empire of DNA was collapsing in silence, another was rising by force. Because the South's genome was not simply erased, it was rewritten violently. And its next chapter begins not with migration, but with chains.
What happens when a civilization collapses in silence, and another does not simply take the land, but rewrites the very blood of its people? That is what happened in the American South. Because while native DNA was vanishing under the weight of disease and forced removal, another demographic force arrived by ship, chained in the dark holds of vessels crossing the Atlantic. Between 1525 and 1866, over 12.5 million Africans were trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean. Of those, nearly 388,000 were brought directly to what is now the United States, and the majority of them were sent to the Southeast, to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, the cotton fields of Mississippi, the rice swamps of South Carolina. By 1860, South Carolina was 57% enslaved. In Mississippi, 55%. Entire states where the majority of the population lived and died in bondage. And with them, the genome of the South was transformed forever. But not by marriage, not by love, by force. Modern genetic studies, like those by Brick et al. 2015 and Para et al. 1998, reveal a striking asymmetry in African American DNA. On the maternal side, mitochondrial DNA passed down from mothers, we see overwhelmingly African lineages. But on the paternal side, the Y chromosome passed down from fathers, European lineages dominate. This is not random. It is proof, forensic proof. Enslaved African men were systematically denied the right to reproduce. European slave owners, overseers, and their sons impregnated enslaved women, generation after generation. It was not a choice. It was ownership written into flesh. The genome became a ledger of power. African American DNA today carries the echo of that violence. African maternal lines, European paternal lines. A structure unlike almost any other population on Earth. It was not one act, it was centuries. A quiet, ongoing machine of demographic transformation, turning people into property and property into bloodline. And yet, just as the genome records violence, it also records resistance. Because not all African ancestry in the South was erased or diluted. In the coastal islands of Georgia, South Carolina, and northern Florida, something extraordinary was preserved. Here, the story changes again. Because isolation, geographic and cultural, created one of the most unique genetic communities in the United States. The Gullah. Along the tidal marshes and barrier islands of the Southeast, geography itself became a paradox, both a prison and a sanctuary. The Africans brought to the rice and indigo plantations of the Sea Islands were cut off from the mainland by creeks, swamps, and tides. To slave owners, this isolation was strategic. It kept laborers contained. But to the enslaved themselves, it became something else. A shield, a fragile barrier against the cultural erasure sweeping across the rest of the South. Here, a people preserved not just their memories, but their very genomes. Modern research, including a 2020-2021 study in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, shows that the Gullah Geechee community maintains between 90 to 95% West African ancestry. Their European admixture is the lowest of any African American population in the United States. Their mitochondrial DNA, particularly haplogroup L3, traces directly to regions like Sierra Leone, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast. These are not diluted descendants. They are living echoes of West Africa, preserved in American soil. But the preservation wasn't only in blood. It was in language. The Gullah Creole, often mocked as broken English, is in truth a linguistic monument. Its grammar and tones mirror West African languages such as Creole and Mende. To the untrained ear, it sounds like a local dialect. To linguists, it is a survival, proof that even in bondage, voices refused to be silenced. It was in craft, sweetgrass basket weaving, identical to those sold in Senegalese markets, survived across centuries. It was in ritual. The ring shout, a spiritual dance of rhythm and circle, mirrored the Bakongo ceremonies of Central Africa. Funeral traditions, placing seashells on graves, echoed beliefs that water connected the living to the ancestors. Even the food was memory. Okra stews, bene seed cookies, red rice, each bite carrying flavors from thousands of miles across the ocean. The Gullah preserved a world within captivity. But even here, the scars remain.
The Y-DNA tells a painful truth. European male intrusion crept in, just as it had across the mainland. The asymmetry of African mothers and European fathers remained visible, encoded forever. And yet, in almost every other way, the Gullah defied erasure. Their language, their rituals, their bloodlines, they resisted, they remembered, they remained. But while one community was preserving its heritage, another across the South was inventing theirs. Because not every Southern ancestry claim was real. Some were myths, dreams woven into family lore.
Not all DNA stories are written in blood. Some are written in myth. And in the American South, perhaps the most enduring of these is the tale of the Cherokee princess. If you've lived in the Southeast, you've probably heard it. A great-grandmother said to be the daughter of a Cherokee chief. A distant ancestor remembered as a proud native princess. A sliver of native heritage claimed across generations, often whispered as a badge of uniqueness. But here's the truth. When scientists analyze the DNA, the myth rarely holds. Genetic testing of thousands of self-identified Cherokee descendants has revealed that the overwhelming majority show little to no Native American ancestry. Instead, their genomes carry European and African markers, sometimes both. So why the myth? Why this obsession with a Cherokee ancestor who never was? Part of the answer lies in history. By the 19th century, open acknowledgement of African ancestry in the South was dangerous. Jim Crow laws and the one-drop rule meant that any trace of African blood carried legal and social stigma. But claiming native ancestry, that was different. It was exotic, it was romanticized, and crucially, it was safer. The Cherokee princess became a mask, a way for families to explain darker skin, unusual features, or oral traditions of non-European roots without ever mentioning Africa. This wasn't just personal, it became cultural. In the early 20th century, entire genealogical societies were founded on supposed native ancestry that DNA has since disproven. In reality, most of those lineages trace back not to the Cherokee, but to enslaved Africans and their descendants. The genome has exposed the myth, and yet in doing so, it has done something powerful. It has restored truth to millions of African American families whose heritage was hidden under generations of silence. But myths are not the only ghosts in Southern DNA, because beneath the soil, deeper still, lie whispers far older, traces of forgotten migrations, mysterious lineages, and even genetic shadows that connect the South to Ice Age hunters and Neanderthal ancestors. If you strip away the layers of slavery, colonization, and myth, you reach something even deeper, the ancient shadows that linger in every genome. Because long before Europeans, Africans, or even the first Native Americans we recognize by name, the Southeast was a crossroads of humanity itself. Archaeology tells us that people were in the Southeast at least 15,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. The Topper site in South Carolina suggests human activity that could date back 20,000 years, pushing the timeline far beyond the Clovis culture once thought to be America's first. And DNA backs it up. Studies of ancient native remains like those from Florida's Wendover Bog reveal mitochondrial haplogroups A, B, C, and D, lineages that trace back to Ice Age Siberia. These are the maternal lines carried by the first Americans, who crossed the Bering Land Bridge during the last glacial maximum. Their descendants spread south, leaving genetic fingerprints across the Southeast. But there's another presence in that DNA, an older one. Because all Native American genomes carry the ghost of interbreeding with Neanderthals. Roughly 2 to 3% of their DNA, inherited from ancient encounters in Eurasia, lives on in every Native American today. Traits like immune system strength, even hair and skin adaptations whisper of this Ice Age inheritance. And that's not all. Recent genetic studies suggest that Native Americans also carry traces of another mysterious lineage, what scientists call a ghost population. An extinct people, neither wholly Asian nor European, who left fragments of themselves inside the first Americans before they crossed into the New World. In the Southeast, these ghost echoes remain, hidden in mitochondrial haplogroups, tucked inside the genomes of tribes like the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Cherokee. It means that when you look at the DNA of the American South, you are not just looking at Africans, Europeans, and natives. You are looking at Ice Age hunters chasing mammoths across frozen tundra. You are looking at Neanderthals huddled in caves 40,000 years ago. You are looking at forgotten peoples whose names we may never know, yet whose blood still flows in millions today. The South's DNA is not just history, it is prehistory, a palimpsest of migrations, extinctions, and survivals written in code older than civilization itself. And yet DNA alone cannot explain what the South became, because genetics tells us who people were, but history tells us what they did. And the South was not only shaped by blood, it was shaped by struggle.
So what does all of this mean? The DNA of the American South is not a simple story of black and white, of native and European. It is a mosaic, layered with invasions, with erasures, with myths and survivals. A record written in bone and blood that no archive, no textbook, no courthouse record could ever preserve. It tells us that the first Southerners were indigenous hunters who walked these lands at the edge of the Ice Age. That their descendants endured centuries before colonization only to see their numbers shattered by disease and removal. That Africans, torn from their homelands, rebuilt entire worlds in bondage, leaving behind not only pain but resilience encoded in every generation. That Europeans did not simply arrive, they rewrote the genome itself through violence, coercion, and power. That in isolated islands, the Gullah preserved Africa in America. That family myths of Cherokee princesses disguised truths too dangerous to admit. That even Neanderthals and lost ghost peoples have their fingerprints in the South today. The DNA of the Southeast is not one story, it is all of them. A convergence of worlds, layered like sediment in a riverbed. And perhaps that is the most Southern truth of all, that identity here has always been complex, that ancestry is not a single thread, but a tapestry of survival. That even when history tried to erase voices, DNA remembered. Because blood does not lie, and in the South, it tells a story more haunting and more human than any myth ever could.